Boldwood presents Letting Go of Yesterday, written by Joe Bartlett and read by Emma Powell. Chapter 1. Laughter drifted down from the end of the wood-panelled corridor that led from Rowan's office to the staff room. Lessons had finished almost 2 hours earlier, but the school was still a hive of activity. She glanced out of one of the windows as she continued towards the staff room. Outside, some of the girls on the all-weather pitch were whizzing hockey balls at a goalkeeper whose protective gear made it look like she'd been wrapped in a duvet. Voices carried up from the hockey practice, and beyond that from the rugby pitches where the first and second teams were training for an upcoming tournament. Membry Grange was never quiet in term time. There were more than 200 boarders on site 7 days a week, and a further 700 day pupils, as well as the large team of staff who took care of them. Even if all of them had teamed up, Rowan still wasn't sure they'd be able to drown out the raucous laughter emanating from the staff room. Okay, what am I missing out on? Because it sounds worth hearing. Smiling, she looked at the two women sitting side by side on a dark green sofa in front of an oak coffee table strewn with magazines. They were the only people in the staff room, which was typical by this time on a Friday evening. It was why a debrief of the week over a cup of coffee was a regular date for the three of them. "Ooh, watch out, Zed's here. We better stop having fun." Odette West, the school's head of modern languages, mimed putting a finger to her lips and then gave another hearty laugh. Rowan might technically be the boss of the other women, but first and foremost she was their friend, and after the day she'd had, she badly needed to know what was so funny. The tension must have shown in her face as Odette stopped laughing and tilted her head to one side. "Why don't you sit down, Rowan? I'll make you a drink and Pippa can tell you what she's just told me." "It's okay, I don't mind making the drinks." Rowan was conscious of her friends treating her slightly differently since she'd become head teacher. Thankfully, it hadn't been a huge change. They were her closest friends after all, and she would have hated to lose that bond as a result of her promotion. But there had been a subtle shift. Before, they'd have taken it in turns to make the drinks if they met up in the staff room. But now, Odette was jumping to her feet and waving away Rowan's offer, as if the idea of the head teacher making the coffee was absurd. "No, I'll get some." Odette gestured towards the seat she'd just vacated. "You're going to want to sit down for this anyway." "Well, I need something stronger than coffee." Rowan looked from Odette to Pippa, who was already laughing again. "I think you might." "And once you've heard it, you're never going to stop imagining what might be going on behind the doors of Keeper's Lodge either." Odette grinned. "I thought we were all the same, living this quiet, boring life, and then bam, you get hit with something like this. It just goes to show you that you never know who your neighbours are." "Okay, now I'm not even sure I want you to tell me." Keeper's Lodge was one of 8 staff houses in the grounds of Membry Grange. Rowan lived in the largest of the properties with her husband James, the school's chaplain, and their 2 children. It was a 4-bedroom detached cottage, somewhat unimaginatively called Head's House. The bursar lived next door, and beyond that was Elderberry Cottage, where Odette lived with her family. In addition to their teaching responsibilities, Odette and her husband were house parents, taking care of some of the boarders. Pippa, who taught English, was also a house parent and lived in Keeper's Lodge with her husband Daniel, who ran the school's farm. They were almost like any other neighbours in a suburban cul-de-sac, except that they lived in the magnificent 250-acre grounds of an exclusive private school, as sheltered from the realities of the real world as their pupils were. It could easily have been a nightmare living in such close proximity to people she had to work with too. But from the moment Rowan had started at Membry Grange 9 years earlier, when her daughter Bella had been less than a year old, it had been like finding her tribe. She'd bonded with Odette and Pippa quickly, and both of them were godmother to Theo, her youngest child, who was now almost 7. She felt blessed to be raising her children in a place like Membry Grange, but clearly something had been going on at Keeper's Lodge. "If you don't want to hear it, I better just show you." Pippa pressed play as she passed her phone to Rowan, and a video of her husband Daniel appeared on the screen. He was wearing a dinner suit and could have been dressed for any one of the events the school regularly hosted, where formal attire was a must. But then suddenly the strains of "You Can Leave Your Hat On" started playing. Daniel turned his back to the screen, flicked up the tails of his jacket, looked over his shoulder and wiggled his bottom like a part-time stripper who should definitely have stuck to the day job. Pippa's distinctive laugh could be heard in the background of the video, and suddenly it was in stereo, and she started laughing again, watching Daniel attempting to remove his jacket in what Rowan assumed was supposed to be a sexy way. Unfortunately, his arm got stuck in the sleeve, and his attempts to flick the jacket off ended up with it wrapped around his head. When Daniel finally emerged, he was laughing too and had abandoned any attempt to take his striptease seriously. He was lip-syncing to the words and pulling ridiculous faces as he slid his belt out of the loops of his trousers and lassoed it around his head. "Oh my God!" Rowan started laughing long before Daniel undid the top 4 buttons of his shirt and pretended to tease his audience by sliding it off one shoulder and up again. By that point, he was laughing too, and the camera was shaking badly. Pippa clearly having lost the battle to hold it steady. The laughter already felt like it had done Rowan some good, but she couldn't help feeling a tiny bit guilty. "Does he know you're showing this to people?" "He gave me permission to show you two, and don't worry, it doesn't go any further than a little hint of shoulder. We were both laughing too much, but it still gets funnier every time I watch it." Poor Daniel, there he was trying to be sexy, and all you could do was laugh. Rowan tried to keep a straight face, but it was impossible. "Oh, don't worry, Daniel knew exactly what he was doing. He knew his sense of humour was what made me fall for him in the first place, and being funny is always going to do it for me." Pippa put down her phone. "If he'd done a striptease with serious intentions, I'd be running for the hills. Thank God it was supposed to be funny, and let's just say he got what he was hoping for." "You've got to give Daniel his due." Odette set the coffee cup down on the table. "Seb is about as subtle as a sledgehammer, grabbing my bum when he walks past, or pricing up against me while I'm trying to make the kids dinner or unload the dishwasher. Why is it some men never seem to grow out of acting like sex-obsessed teenagers? Sometimes I just want to fall asleep in front of the TV without getting pestered, but men are just always bloody well up for it, aren't they?" "I think it's wired into their DNA." Pippa rolled her eyes. "At least Daniel seems to have realised he needs to make an effort over the course of the day if he's going to stand a chance by the time we get into bed, although the dance was a whole new level of effort." "What about James? Does he whip his cassock off for you the moment he gets through the door, or dance for you in just his dog collar?" Odette wiggled her eyebrows suggestively, and Rowan gave a non-committal smile. "Ooh, look, she's gone quiet. You know what that means. It's always the quiet ones you've got to watch." Pippa grinned, and Rowan shrugged, grateful that her friend's imagination had let her off the hook. She could have told them the truth, and a big part of her desperately wanted to confide in someone, but she just couldn't do it. How was she supposed to admit to her 2 closest friends that she couldn't remember the last time she'd had sex with her husband, and that when she tried to reach out and touch him, he rolled away, making an elaborate show of snoring, even when she'd been certain from the sound of his breathing that he'd been awake just seconds before? Heat swept over her at the thought of the attempt she'd made to spark his interest when they'd been away for the weekend for their wedding anniversary. Thank God no one had videoed that, because it had been mortifying to be a part of, never mind how humiliating it would have been for anyone else to see it. Daniel had nothing to be embarrassed about in comparison. Rowan had spent a fortune on the type of lingerie that an online forum had informed her was guaranteed to reignite the passion. When James had emerged from the bathroom after his shower, she'd been lying on the bed, in a position a contortionist would have been proud of, in an attempt to flaunt her best bits and disguise the parts of her body she hated the most, which these days seemed to be the majority of it. When the person who was supposed to love you most didn't seem to find you remotely attractive, it was hard to hold on to any shred of self-esteem. James' eyes had widened in what she'd hoped was surprise, but which she'd had a feeling now had been far closer to horror. He'd mumbled something about having an upset stomach and had bolted straight back into the bathroom, where he'd remained for the next 20 minutes. By the time he'd re-emerged, Rowan had got dressed and downed half a bottle of champagne to drown her sorrows in the wake of James's reaction to her attempt at seducing him. He'd been all smiles when he'd finally come back out of the bathroom, reminding Rowan that they had plans for dinner in 30 minutes. Thought he had a bad stomach. Even the words had tasted bitter in her mouth, and she'd taken another huge slug of champagne to try and wash them away. Think it was just a bit of cramp, but I feel fine now. He'd smiled again, and she'd felt like slapping the expression off his face. The mixture of humiliation and anger were a dangerous combination. Funny that. The sight of me without my clothes on always seems to make you feel ill just lately. Rowan, please. What, not this again? Is that what you're going to say? She took another glug of champagne. Don't worry, I don't want to have the same conversation we've had 100 times before again either. It always goes the same way anyway. I ask you what's wrong and tell you how unattractive it makes me feel, and you come up with half a dozen excuses to avoid admitting that anything's wrong. Except we both know it is. Having young kids and busy jobs is tough on us both. Every relationship goes through changes and dry spells. I'm sure things will shift again in the future. He'd reached out then and put a hand on her shoulder, but she'd shaken him off and refilled her glass. She'd wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that more than 18 months without any physical intimacy didn't represent the kind of dry spell that everyone went through. It was a goddamn Sahara desert. Rowan had never been confident and had often felt like she came last on the list with her parents. Her father had been a workaholic, and her mother had seemed to feel hemmed in when she was at home, always finding somewhere else to go or something else to do instead. Rowan had never felt at ease with her appearance either. At 5'9", she'd been taller than most of the boys growing up and had felt awkward and clumsy. She'd had hair that had been almost the exact same shade as ginger nut biscuits, which was the nickname that had stuck all the way through school. She might have eventually grown into the limbs that had once felt far too long and started receiving compliments about how beautiful her hair was and how her height meant she could have been a model. But inside, she still felt like the gawky kid with red hair. When she hit her teens, she'd had a good group of friends, but she was still quite shy outside of that circle and preferred going unnoticed to attracting the kind of comments that might make her face flush red and clash with her hair. Then something had changed. Maybe because she'd begun to excel at school and her confidence no longer seemed to pivot on whether or not someone called her ginger nut. Just when she'd begun to feel comfortable in her own skin, her parents' marriage had ended in a way that had made them the talk of Port Agnes, and all she'd wanted to do was hide again. Everything that had happened had robbed Rowan of the confidence she'd finally begun to build up, and when she and her mother had started over somewhere new, she'd gone back to being the girl standing in the corner, desperately hoping to blend into the background. Except then she'd met James, and he hadn't seemed to notice how awkward she felt. They'd been friends at first, and maybe that's why she'd never been tongue-tied or embarrassed around him. Instead, she'd been completely herself, the way most teenagers never truly are, and he'd liked her anyway. Over the years, her confidence had grown, not just because of James, but because she was proud of what she'd achieved in her career and her personal life. Until things had started to change again, as they always seemed to do, and it hadn't taken much for that fragile confidence to unravel. James's unwillingness to touch her fed straight into the self-loathing she'd fought so hard to conquer. She was ugly, she must be, and the fact that her husband would rather fake a stomachache than have sex with her proved it. Rowan hadn't said any of those things to James. Instead, she'd drunk more of the champagne and gone out to dinner with him as planned. They'd stuck to safe ground and talked about the children, and she tried not to think too much about whether there was someone else he'd rather be with, someone he wanted to touch in the way he never wanted to touch her anymore. He'd never been particularly passionate, but his disinterest had grown since the birth of their second child and had tailed off altogether around the time that Izzy Hennessy, the new religious education teacher, had joined the school. Izzy worked closely with James, and Rowan had seen them together, looking far more like a touchy-feely couple than he had with his own wife. They always looked as though they were laughing at some private joke, and more lately she wondered if she might be the butt of that joke. She didn't want to believe it of James. They'd been a couple since they were 19, and he was the school chaplain, a man so devoted to his beliefs that he went on regular retreats to connect with his faith on a deeper level, and who volunteered with several Christian charities. His father was a retired bishop, and there was no way he'd have an affair. She was sure of it. Almost. Except now, sitting here and listening to her two friends talk about their husbands, she knew something was wrong. They were all around the same age. They all had children and marriages of a similar length. James's job was arguably the least physically demanding of any of them. Yet for well over a year, he'd allegedly been too exhausted to sleep with his wife. During that same period, he'd started undertaking weekly faith walks with Izzy. She should confront him and ask outright if there was something going on between him and Izzy. But somehow it felt far easier to bury herself in work. Although she was about to discover that she wasn't hiding her worries nearly as well as she'd thought. All joking aside, Ro, you've been really quiet lately. Are you okay? Pippa narrowed her eyes, seeming to answer her own question before Rowan even tried. You're not, are you? What's up? Is it just the job, or... Pippa's eyes hadn't left her face, and Rowan wished her friend would look away. It would be far easier to lie to her if she did. Then she could pretend the job was the only thing bothering her. But Pippa still hadn't broken eye contact. Work is busy. It's not just that, though, is it? The eye contact was too intense, and Rowan found herself blurting out the words she'd never intended to say. I think James might be having an affair. She looked from Pippa to Odette, trying to read their expressions, now that the unthinkable suggestion was out there. Membury Grange could be a hotbed of gossip, and if there really was something going on between her husband and Izzy, there was a good chance one of them had heard a rumour. Although if Odette knew, she clearly missed her vocation as an actress, because her eyebrows had shot up in surprise and disappeared behind her fringe, her mouth forming a silent O, and Pippa had furrowed her brow. I can't see it. James? She made it sound ridiculously far-fetched, as if Rowan had suggested that her husband was secretly working for MI5. Me neither. Odette sat down next to her. He always seems devoted to the job and the kids, and... You can't finish that sentence, can you? Rowan looked at her friend. That should have been the moment when Odette had said, and to you, but she hadn't been able to do it, because it was obvious, even from the outside, that James wasn't devoted to Rowan. Well, I mean, you're the head teacher and he's a chaplain, so I wouldn't expect to see you walking around the school holding hands. Odette gave her a weak smile. No, but you, me and Pippa socialise together with our husbands, and I've seen the way Seb looks at you and how Daniel is with Pippa. It's starting to feel as if James and I are more like friends than husband and wife, and if he moved any further over to his side of the bed, he'd be on the floor. It can be easy to drift into complacency in a long-term relationship. Pippa's tone was soothing. But I'm sure James wouldn't do anything to risk your marriage. Have there been any other signs to make you suspicious? There's supposed to be a whole list of dead giveaways if someone is having an affair. Oh, there are. And wanting either more or less sex than usual is just one of them. Odette nodded sagely, and then began reeling off a list of other signs that a partner was cheating, counting each item off on her fingers as she did so. Just taking more care of his appearance, being secretive about his phone and seeming more distant. Then there's working late or starting up new hobbies that keep him out of the house, spending money he can't account for, and criticizing you more. Oh, and mentionitis, where he can't stop bringing up her name. That's a big one. Pippa laughed. You sound like a divorce lawyer. How'd you know all of this? Because when Celine thought her husband was cheating, we did our research. Odette wrinkled her nose. And he was, of course. I felt so bad for my sister, but he was ticking every box. I bet James isn't. Odette looked at Rowan expectantly, and she wanted to be able to reassure herself and her friends that none of those things applied to James. But it wasn't true. He did seem more distant, and he was out of the house more often. But he didn't fit the description in other ways, and, unlike Odette's sister, Rowan couldn't take every telltale sign off the list. I wondered if it might be Izzy, They're spending a lot of time together, but he doesn't really mention her in between. There's no unexplained spending, and he never criticises me, the opposite, if anything. Rowan sighed heavily. Well, surely that's a good thing, then? Pippa put an arm around her shoulders, and Rowan desperately tried to blink back the tears burning her eyes. I don't know if it is. At least if there was someone else, I could pin a reason on why everything feels as if it's changing. But it's like he's slowly pulling away instead, and there's a distance between us that makes me feel so lonely. If that's happening, and there's no one else involved, it's almost worse, because it means he's had enough of us, of me, and I don't think there's any coming back from that. Oh, Ro, it won't be that. Pippa pulled her in for a hug. There'll be something else going on with work that he hasn't told you about. You know what he's like when he's supporting someone going through a crisis? It consumes him. He's just got this tendency to take other people's problems on as his own. That's all it will be. It's true. He was like that when Graham Johnson was going through that disciplinary process before the old Ed left. Odette lowered her voice, as if even in an empty staff room someone might overhear them. You would have thought it was James facing the sack, and it took him months to get over the fact that he couldn't help Graham keep his job. He'll just be navigating someone else's crisis again. Once it's over, you'll get him back, like you did last time. I hope so. Rowan sighed again, but far less heavily this time. She hadn't intended to offload any of this on her friends, but she was glad she had, because the idea of her marriage being over felt far less inevitable. She didn't want her children to go through what she'd faced in the wake of her parents' horribly messy divorce. It had resulted in Rowan's life being split between Cornwall and London, a mountain of bitterness, and her family being the subject of gossip in Port Agnes for years. Things between her and James might not be perfect, and sometimes she felt lonely in her marriage, but she still loved him. He was her best friend. He had been since she'd met him when she'd first moved to London, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing him. Pippa and Odette were right. She was allowing her fear of history repeating itself to make mountains out of molehills, and she needed to stop before she drove a wedge between herself and James that was entirely of her own creation. I know so. Pippa nodded, emphasising her certainty. I also know that what we need is a night out, one where we're no one's mums, teachers or boss, and I think tonight is as good a night as any. James is doing a shift at the food bank tonight, so I've got the kids and I said I'd be home by 6. But you could come for a takeaway and some drinks at mine. Rowan couldn't keep the hopeful note out of her voice. She hadn't realised how much she needed a night with her closest friends until Pippa had suggested it. No, absolutely not. We need a proper night out. Pippa whipped her mobile phone out of her pocket. I'll text Daniel now and let him know that Bella and Theo will be having a sleepover at ours tonight. You can't just drop that on him. Rowan was pretty sure this wasn't how Pippa's husband had envisaged spending his Friday evening. I'll make it up to him tomorrow night. Pippa grinned, and Rowan tried not to let uneasy feelings about her own relationship wash over her again. Comparison was the thief of joy, she knew that, and just because she and James weren't having sex, it didn't mean their marriage was over. When she'd had girls' night out in the past with Pippa and Odette, and one of them was approached by some sleazy chancer who wouldn't take no for an answer, it had made them appreciate their partners all the more. None of them were married to the kind of creepy guys who sat down uninvited, making leery comments about their bodies and trying to force them to accept unwanted drinks. Pippa was right. She needed a night out to get things into perspective and to appreciate how lucky she was to be married to someone as kind and caring as James. Living and working at the school was intense, and a change of scene would do her the world of good. If you're sure Daniel won't mind, the kids would love that. What about you, Odette? Can you make it? That's the glory of having teenagers. They'll be up in their rooms and they won't know whether I'm there or not, as long as there's food in the house. Odette rolled her eyes. Sebby's home tonight anyway, and I suspect they'll be only too glad to order pizzas in for them all. I don't really like takeaway pizza, so they'll all be thrilled to get a chance to eat junk food and watch sport all evening long. It's a date then? Pippa gave Rowan's shoulders a squeeze. We'll leave mine about 7:15. How about cocktails and tapas at Positano's for a kick-off, and then we'll see where the night leads us. Sounds perfect to me. Rowan breathed out slowly. It really did sound like the perfect night, and she was more thankful than ever to have such good friends who'd never stopped treating her like she was one of the gang, despite the direction her career had taken. There was so much in her life that she had to be grateful for, and she was certain that by the end of the night she'd be able to reel off a list even longer than the one Odette had shared.
You do know that flossing stopped being a thing more than 5 years ago, don't you?
Odette raised her eyebrows as Pippa tried for the third time to perfect the deceptively difficult dance move that somehow left her looking like one of those inflatable tube men outside second-hand car dealerships.
I just want my arms and hips to move in unison the way they're supposed to, but it's like rubbing your belly and patting your head at the same time.
Pippa pulled a face as she tried again, managing this time to look as stiff and awkward as the Tin Man.
Anyway, flossing, like twerking, is timeless.
I don't think they are timeless, and judging by the looks we're getting, no one thinks that women approaching 40 should be doing either move. Rowan looked over at a group of young women at the far end of the bar, who seemed to be using Pippa as their main source of entertainment. When Odette had suggested they go on to a Cuban place that had a dance floor, it had sounded like a great idea. But Rowan hadn't expected the average age of the clientele to be around 20. She spent the whole night furtively glancing around to make sure none of the sixth formers from school were there. That would have been mortifying.
They just don't know a good dancer when they see one,
Pippa said loudly, gesticulating towards the younger women. She'd begun downing cocktails as soon as they got to Positano's, at a rate that neither Odette nor Rowan had been able to keep up with. They'd been in the Cuban for less than half an hour, and she'd already downed 2 more mojitos.
We should go to the Moonlight Room. It's over 30s night on a Friday.
God, that sounds grim. Odette took the words out of Rowan's mouth.
It really isn't, I promise you.
Pippa was starting to slur her words slightly.
I went there with the rest of the English department for Henrietta Granger's leaving do, and most of the other people in there were over 50. I haven't felt that young in years.
Pippa's laugh was getting louder too, and Rowan exchanged a look with Odette, who was shaking her head.
That just makes it sound worse. It'll be full of divorced men bitter about life and blaming women for their problems, but still desperate to take one home. I don't care. I just want to dance.
Pippa did an extravagant twirl, very nearly knocking a member of staff who was carrying a tray of empty glasses flying. Whether we go to the Moonlight Room or not, maybe it's time to get out of here. Rowan looked at Odette again, who nodded vigorously in response, and she couldn't help smiling. Okay, so it might not have been quite the night she'd planned, and it looked like they might end up heading home well before 10 p.m, but it had been fun. There'd been lots of laughs, a bit of putting the world to rights, and thankfully Pippa was entertaining rather than obnoxious when she got drunk. She'd said she was going to make the most of her first night out in months, and she warned them that she hadn't eaten anything all day other than half a slice of toast that one of the kids had left at breakfast. So it was probably no surprise the first couple of drinks had gone straight to Pippa's head, which had made her even keener to order more. Odette clearly had no intention of going on to the Moonlight Room, and Rowan was happy to call it a night too. It didn't matter that the evening had been cut short. It had more than served its purpose in reminding her just how many amazing things she had in her life, and just how good a night off from all her responsibilities, laughing and talking with her friends could be. She'd probably end up getting home before James even got back from the food bank. Friday evenings were always busy, especially this close to the end of the month when people's money had run out. They also had children to feed over the weekend with no free school meals to bridge the gap. It was another reminder how lucky she was. Her children had never had to go without, and she'd never had to face the dilemma of having to choose heating or eating, or going hungry so that her children didn't have to. Her family lived in the grounds of an exclusive private school, in a bubble that protected them from all the hardship that so many other people had to face. She was incredibly lucky, and she never wanted to forget it. In their situation, it was no wonder James felt the need to help out with other charitable causes and give up so much of his time to support people who really needed him. It would never be enough just to be chaplain to a bunch of privileged children. Her friends were right. James was almost certainly worried and distracted because of some of the work he did. He wouldn't want to burden Rowan with it when he knew the stresses of her own job and the expectations of parents at the school weighed so heavily on her. As soon as they were at home together, she was going to talk to him properly. Not about their sex life, but about what else it was that was worrying him and what she could do to help alleviate his burden. It wasn't just Rowan who felt the impact of him growing more distant. It affected the children too, especially Theo. She'd seen her son try to get his father's attention, but he never really did, because James was far more concerned with other people's children. She admired her husband immensely for all the work he did, but she couldn't allow that to come at such a cost to their own son. She didn't want Theo to go through the things she had as a child, when her parents had seemed incapable of ever putting her first. There had to be a balance. She loved James. He was an amazing man, and the first thing Rowan was going to do was to let him know that. She wasn't going to ask him to change who he was, but they needed to find a way forward together.
Yes, let's get out of here before we get bad. You can dance all the way back to Memory Grange if you want to, Pippa. Just please promise me you won't try to twerk in the street.
Odette linked one arm through Pippa's, and Rowan did the same on the other side.
I can't make any promises, Pippa shrugged. Anyway, I don't want to go home. You two can be party poopers if you like, but just walk with me as far as the Moonlight Room and leave me there. One thing at a time. We've got to get you down the stairs first.
Rowan laughed again as they headed out, looking like they were training for the three-legged race at Sports Day and needing a hell of a lot more practice to get it right. Once they were out on the street, the cool night air seemed to work a little bit of magic in sobering Pippa up.
I think you're right about the Moonlight Room being a bad idea. It's freezing and I just want to go home and put my feet on Daniel to warm them up.
She rested her head on Rowan's shoulder for a moment.
He's so lovely. He always lets me put my cold feet on him to leech off all his body heat.
He's a keeper, all right. Rowan smiled into the darkness. A few hours earlier, she might have felt another stab of envy at her friend's words. But she was counting her own blessings now too, and she couldn't wait to get home either.
I'm impressed with the pace you've picked up, Pippa.
Odette still had her arm linked through Pippa's on the other side.
I did think we might have to suggest stopping off at the food bank and getting James to help carry you home. We're virtually going past the door anyway. I'm not that bad. I'm just tipsy, that's all. Tipsy, that's me.
She laughed at her own stupid joke as they rounded the corner of the road where the food bank was. It was less than half a mile back to the school grounds, and Rowan was confident now that they could make it, although a big part of her was hoping they did bump into James. She liked the idea of them walking home together and maybe slipping her hand into his. It wouldn't be about making any kind of move, just reconnecting in a casual, easy kind of way, and maybe taking the first steps towards getting back on track. They were 30 metres away from the entrance to the food bank on the opposite side of the road when James suddenly emerged with a group of other people, including Izzy. Rowan's first instinct had been to yell out his name, but something stopped her.
Look, it's James!
Pippa's loud exclamation was too far away to be heard, and Rowan tightened her grip on her friend's arm, pulling them all into the doorway of an estate agent's, where they couldn't be seen but still had sight of James. I know, but Izzy is there too, and I just want... All the doubts had suddenly come flooding back. I just want to see them say goodbye, and I don't want him to know I'm watching.
Right. Gotcha.
Pippa gave an exaggerated nod and made an elaborate show of putting her finger to her lips and loudly shushing Odette, who hadn't said anything yet, but who then began to whisper.
It doesn't look like anything suspicious to me. They're all just saying goodbye and everyone seems to be getting the same hug.
I know, but I just want to wait. Rowan kept her voice low, but her heartbeat was pounding in her ears, and she held her breath as she kept her eyes firmly fixed on her husband. She watched him hugging his fellow volunteers in turn, including Izzy, but there was nothing to mark her out from the others, who headed off into the night one by one. A few seconds later, Izzy turned away from James too, walking in Rowan's direction, holding the hand of a young man who looked to be about the same age as she was. The two of them had been the last to leave, leaving James standing outside the food bank on his own.
I don't want her to see us standing here. We need to pretend we're looking at houses or something. Rowan pulled her friends back out of the doorway until all three of them were facing the window of the estate agents and harnessing their inner Meryl Streep, pretending to peruse the best the local housing market had to offer. Rowan watched Izzy and her companion out of the corner of her eye, still hand in hand and completely oblivious to the three women, until they reached the end of the street and rounded the corner. See, I told you James wasn't the type. All that worrying for nothing. Pippa shook her head before loudly hiccuping. Come on, let's all go home and warm our feet up on our lovely husbands. Why don't we try and catch up to James now? Odette turned to look at Rowan, and she'd been about to agree, when another figure emerged from the food bank. He and James were talking as the other man locked the door. There was nothing out of the ordinary about it, until the man suddenly turned to face James, the two of them illuminated by the light of the street lamp. And the world seemed to move in slow motion as James reached up and put a hand on the back of the man's head, drawing it down towards him and kissing him in a way that was so unmistakably filled with passion that acid bile rose in Rowan's throat, shock and nausea presenting the very real possibility that she might throw up. Oh, shit. Pippa's mouth fell open as the words tumbled out, and Odette gasped in a way that made it feel like she'd sucked all the air out of the world just for a moment. But it wasn't her friend's dramatic intake of breath that had knocked the wind out of Rowan. It was the realization that all the feelings she'd wanted him to have for her belonged to someone else. Her greatest fears had become a reality in that instant, and as she struggled to remember how to breathe, she knew nothing in her world would ever be the same again. Chapter 2. 6 months later. The drive from Membury Grange to Port Agnes had taken 3 hours so far. As Rowan glanced in the rear-view mirror, now that they were just 2 miles from their destination, the sight of her daughter's red-rimmed eyes made her want to start crying again too. Saying goodbye to everyone had been incredibly hard. They were leaving behind their closest friends. Rowan had given up her dream job after less than 2 years, one she'd never thought she'd have secured at just 36, and the children were being forced to change schools too. All of those things would have been enough reason for tears, but Bella had cried hardest of all saying goodbye to her father. He'd only just returned after a sabbatical to a school in Tanzania, where he'd been for almost 3 months, and now they were leaving him behind. "Why can't Dad come with us?" Bella had pleaded with Rowan for an answer, and she shot James a look that must surely have conveyed all the rage bubbling up inside her. He had begged her, literally on his knees, not to tell the children the real reason why she'd decided to quit her job and return to the village on the Cornish Atlantic coast where she'd grown up. He'd sobbed, telling her that if his father and the rest of his family found out the truth about his sexuality, they'd never speak to him again. He'd lose his job as chaplain of the exclusive private school founded on the Christian principles he espoused on a daily basis, the same principles that were forcing him to live a lie. If he'd been anyone else, her heart would have broken for him, having to tear himself in two like that, trying to live up to the ideals and doctrine he'd been raised with, which was so at odds with who he really was. He was a gay man, and he should have been able to be open about that and free to fall in love with anyone he wanted to. But the empathy she felt for him was clouded by anger, because he'd forced her to unwittingly live that lie too. At least James had known it was all a pretense. Despite her anger, she still hadn't wanted to throw him to the wolves, to tell everyone what had really ended their marriage. Pippa and Odette had seen it for themselves, but they'd agreed to carry the secret too, because Rowan had asked them to. They'd probably told their own husbands, and things like this had a way of getting out eventually. There were already rumours flying around the school about why Rowan was leaving and what had happened between her and James, but there'd been no public declaration that they were divorcing, despite the fact that she'd begun proceedings within a week of discovering his affair. The only announcement she'd made was that she'd decided to take a job back where she'd grown up, to be closer to her parents.
She had no idea what James was telling people about why he'd decided not to go with her. She didn't care what anyone else thought, but she resented the fact that their children were still living a lie. James had begged her with just as much passion not to tell Bella and Theo that he was gay, not until the time was right. It was a decision she'd wrestled with, but in the end, she decided that maybe he was right. There'd been so much change for them to deal with, and she hadn't wanted their father's sexuality to become the talk of Membury Grange while they were all still there. She didn't want their new start to be plagued by gossip either. She knew only too well that Port Agnes was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but she wasn't going to feed that. They'd just have to draw their own conclusions about why she'd moved back to Cornwall without her husband. Only her mother knew the whole story, and Rowan had sworn her to secrecy, making her promise not even to tell her stepfather Dean. Her father and step-parents knew James had been involved with someone else, but not the full details, because she didn't want the children to find out due to an accidental throwaway comment. She was aware it might look to some people like the marriage wasn't necessarily over for good as a result, even though that couldn't have been further from the truth. After the initial screaming and crying on Rowan's part had finally stopped, and the pleading from James had got him the secrecy he wanted, it had all been painfully civil, until it came to the point where her children were sobbing and she couldn't be honest with them about why their father was staying behind. All Rowan cared about was how they were coping, and she could have murdered James with her bare hands for standing there silently, wallowing in his own self-pity and making her the fall guy for all that they'd lost. As Bella had pleaded for James to come with them, it had been on the tip of her tongue to scream out the truth and tell their 10-year-old daughter that the reason her father couldn't move to Cornwall was because he was in love with another man and had been for more than 2 years. The fact that her husband had been sharing another man's bed at every opportunity he got for all of that time was information Rowan could probably have done without. But the one thing she'd insisted on when the overwhelming emotions had finally started to recede had been total honesty, at least between the two of them. It was the only way they were going to be able to move forward in any meaningful kind of way and be able to co-parent. Maybe if she'd known what that total honesty would look like, she'd have asked for a watered-down version. Ewan Samuels, the head of Christians in the community, the charity that ran the food bank and other projects, was the love of her husband's life. Meeting him had forced James to confront something he'd struggled to suppress for years. He still loved Rowan, he'd told her. Of course he did. Just not the way a husband was supposed to love his wife. He'd said he wished it wasn't true and that he'd tried so hard to ignore his feelings for Ewan, but they'd been bigger than him in the end. If any of that was supposed to make Rowan feel better, it had failed. Despite everything he'd told her, he'd seemed genuinely shocked by the decision she'd reached in the early hours of the morning, 3 days after she'd discovered his relationship with Ewan, after they'd sat up all night talking. She'd cried more tears than she'd ever have thought possible in that time, after her life had been ripped off its axis. But she already knew one thing for certain. I can't stay here. Sooner or later, it's all going to come out, and I don't want to get up every morning and go to work, knowing that everyone is talking about me, and worse still, feeling sorry for me. I'm not living like that again, and it's the last thing I want for Bella and Theo. She'd shuddered at the memory of what it had been like to live in a village that had suddenly felt like a goldfish bowl after the spectacular collapse of her own parents' marriage. Her mother had fallen in love with Dean, her father's business partner in his construction firm. He was 15 years her junior, and they'd set up home together in the cottage Dean's mother had owned. Her father had stood outside, screaming at the pair of them for hours on end, and he'd seemed completely heartbroken. But within a week, her mother's best friend, Marion, had left her husband of over 10 years and moved in with Rowan's father, Tony. She told him that she'd been secretly in love with him for years. It had been messy and incredibly embarrassing, especially when rumours had begun circulating that her parents had been part of a wife-swapping circle, something her mother, Katrina, had assured her wasn't true, and that the only crime she committed had been to find the love of her life when she was already married to someone else. Up until that point, Rowan's biggest worry had been her upcoming GCSEs and the burning pain of unrequited love that had finally been on the verge of changing into something with the potential to be wonderful. She'd never liked being the centre of attention, and she never had been. But overnight, it had happened in the most unwelcome of ways. The one thing she was certain of was that she didn't want that for her children. "You can't leave. Where will you go?" "Home." The word had made it feel like she had something alien and uncomfortable in her mouth, like an oversized gobstopper. Home? Could she even call it that anymore? She'd lived there for the first 16 years of her life, but after her parents' divorce, she'd spent more time in London than she had in Cornwall. Her mother had moved there with Dean 2 months after their affair had come to light, and Rowan had been forced to stay in Cornwall until she'd finished her GCSEs. But she transferred to a sixth form college in London for A-levels. It wasn't because she'd sided with her mother rather than her father. She'd been just as angry with both of them for a long time. But London had felt like the lesser of two evils, and the chance to escape from the scrutiny of village life. After more than 2 decades away, it was no wonder the word home felt so odd when she was talking about Port Agnes. It was probably why James had looked at her as if she'd suggested moving to Mars. Yet in the wake of her own marriage falling apart, she was suddenly sure that moving back to Cornwall was the only thing she could do. Her mother had returned to the village a few years ago after almost 20 years away, when Dean's mother had died and left her cottage to them. So now her parents were back to living in the same village. Her father and Marion had a son together, Charlie, who was now 22 and on a post-university adventure travelling through Asia. Rowan adored her little brother, and she got on well with both sets of parents and step-parents. But for years, it had been like a military operation keeping them apart to keep the peace. She'd always hoped they'd patch things up one day, and there'd been a definite thawing of the previously very tense relationship between her parents once her mother and Dean had moved back to Cornwall. So she knew they'd all rally around to provide a support network if she asked them to. And she needed that more than anything now that her marriage was over. "When you say home, do you mean Cornwall?" James had continued looking at her like she had 2 heads. Yes. She'd been more certain than ever in that moment, the doubt on his face just serving to harden her resolve. "I could come with you. What the hell for?" "I've been thinking." She should have cut him off then and told him he had no right to think anything, let alone make any kind of suggestion about where she and the kids might go. He'd made this mess, and she was the one who needed to find a way to try and clear it up. Except for some reason she hadn't stopped him. She'd wanted to hear just how ridiculous his suggestion for the way forward was going to be. But even she hadn't anticipated what came out of his mouth next. "There's no reason why everything has to change, at least not all at once. We could stay living as a family and raising the kids together. In fact, it would probably be easier now we all know where we stand." "Oh, would it?" Rowan had somehow kept her tone level instead of screaming at him, even if sarcasm was dripping from her voice. "And what about Ewan? Is he going to move in with us too?" "Of course not." James had tutted then, as if she was being deliberately difficult. "But I could apply for a parish somewhere, and if Ewan got a job up there, he could get to know the children bit by bit, as Daddy's friend at first, and then—" "As the man who blew their parents' marriage apart." She'd cut him off, but she was shaking her head. "No, actually, that wasn't Ewan, that was you. If you think I'm being part of some weird throuple just to make life easier for you, then you're sadly mistaken. It's not about us, it's about the kids." The pious look on his face had made her blood boil as he tried to turn it around on her. "Is that who you were thinking of when you were snogging his face off outside the food bank? Anyone could have seen you, but I did." He tried to protest, but there were things she needed to get off her chest, and he'd lost the right to take the moral high ground a long time ago. "I know you think I'm supposed to understand and feel sorry for you, but no one would expect me to do that if Ewan had been another woman. Either way, you don't get to have any say in where I take the kids until we can get through the fallout of what you've done and you're ready to be honest with them. You sure as hell don't get to come with us while you work through it all. In fact, you're going to have to find somewhere else to live while I'm working my notice, because I can't spend the next few months pretending nothing's wrong. If I move out, everyone's going to start asking questions, and what if Odette or Pippa give one of them the answer? It's not going to stay a secret forever. Rowan had sighed, because she'd been no more ready for it to come out than he had. She was still processing it herself. She might think his idea of slowly introducing Ewan to the children was ridiculous, but giving them time to adjust to life in Port Agnes before they'd come to terms with everything else didn't seem like a bad idea at all. You've been offered the chance to take a sabbatical to Tanzania before, and I think now would be the perfect time for you to go. By the time you're back, my notice period will be almost over, and I'll have been able to make a plan for the longer term. I don't think we should rush into something so final. James had widened his eyes. And Tanzania is not somewhere I can see myself. It's up to you. She'd cut him off, her tone as cold as ice. You can either face everyone now and tell them the truth, or you can give me some space and get out of my life until I have the chance to get out of yours. But I'm leaving and taking the kids with me, and there's nothing you can do about it. She'd been so sure back then that she was doing the right thing for Bella and Theo, and nothing that James, Pippa, or Odette could say had dented that belief. She'd held on to that certainty through handing in her notice and applying for new jobs all over Cornwall. It had sustained her through the interview at the same village school she'd attended as a child, overriding her fears about taking such a huge step back in her career. She'd accepted the job and would be starting after the holidays, having rented a house in Port Agnes, still certain it was right for her children.